Since January 2023, 9 months before October 7th, the state of Israel and Jews around the world have been witness to some really hectic stuff in a battle around what has become known as judicial reform. Now, this struggle has actually raised many, many questions and a lot of noise. But the issue that really it stands on and that it's revolving around is Jewish freedom. How does freedom look in a Jewish state? And that's really the question that we're going to talk about today. But because it's really not long before Pesach, which is the time of our freedom, we're actually going to ask 4 questions. And the 4 questions, Rav Ramon, are, firstly, Dayeinu Bibi. Is it not enough? Is Israel a democracy or a monarchy? Should Israel be a democracy or a monarchy? And are these actually the right questions to ask? Now, just a reminder to everyone that what we're doing here is we are exercising the right for machloket l'shem shamayim, meaning that we have 2 sides of a question. We've seen around the world and in Israel that these questions have divided people quite hectically, quite aggressively. And what we want to do today, as we do in our discussions in 2 Jews and a Scotch, is we're going to take that back a little, where we say there may be 2 ways to look at something, but we're not going to argue about it from the point of view of the emotion, from the point of view of what we believe, but rather from the point of view of the Torah. What does the Torah think? Are there 2 ideas? Each one of us is going to take a different side. Whether we agree with it or not, you won't know, and that's not the point. The point is machloket l'shem shamayim. The point is how we argue in the sense of finding a greater truth or multiple truths. And that's how we're going to go. So, Rav Ramon, I'm going to hand over to you to begin the process.
So thanks, Ilana, and hello to everybody. I think the first thing I'll start off with is a Scotch. So right. Thank you very much for this Loch Lomond single grain Scotch whiskey. L'chaim, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shakol neh bidvaro.
Amen.
I have not tasted that before, and that is really interesting.
It's an interesting one.
Wow, that's a different taste.
And we'll just enjoy it before Pesach when we can't have whiskey.
Right, so we're going to get rid of some chometz now. But one of the things that we have to do at this point in time, of course, is to let people know what our points of view were on our last discussion, which we have not yet done. So our last discussion was around Purim and should Jews rejoice at the deaths of their enemies. I had taken the stance that yes, we should, and you had taken the opposite stance. So would you like to reveal your own particular stance first?
Okay, well, I would say that my stance was somewhere between the 2. That I understood the need for rejoicing, but I was very perturbed by it. So I actually had taken a little bit more of what I had actually spoken about.
Right. So from my side, what I found interesting is my own development over the past 2 years, which is, I think, something that you and I have spoken about as well, where I think, 2 years ago, I would have been very, very much on the side of don't rejoice and not seeing much need for it at all. And as time went by, after October 7th, I think I definitely shifted more into this into the direction that I actually did uphold in the end. And I think that part of it is a principled position that, based on where you're standing and the exigencies of the time, that sometimes you do need to have some sort of expression like this, particularly over a period where there's been this massive outgrowth of anti-Semitism and this real sense of being attacked as Jews around the world. And also, I think I felt very, very firmly that we needed to examine this event in the light of the fact of the fact that we probably felt, I definitely felt, and I'm sure many did, a sense that Hashem had let this happen to us, and that the rejoicing or the statement that Hashem had actually helped save us was an important factor, and that it needed to be brought to front and center, definitely from a religious sentiment perspective of feeling behester panim, God's hiddenness. I think that's where I landed up, definitely now. And, I think seen myself gravitate more towards that. I think then today we're going to start off with some context, because so many of us have seen what's gone on in Israel since January 2023, and the issues seem to come out of nowhere. Like, didn't seem to be a long-running issue. This whole judicial reform and who should have the power in Israel. Should it be the Knesset? Should it be the parliament? Or should it be the judges? So let's just start with that and begin at the very beginning, at the Declaration of Israel's independence. So as you know, the Declaration of Israel's independence says that one of the things that they're going to do is create a constitution. Now, of course, this is something that we look at definitely in South Africa. We love our constitution. Americans love their constitution, but not everyone has a constitution. Britain does not have a constitution. So, but in the Declaration of Independence, they said we're going to make a constitution. Of course, they then declared the state, and pretty soon after that had to fight a war. But by 1949, that had ended. So they should make a constitution. What really was interesting is that inside the political parties, there was a big division, and really a minority that nevertheless wielded a lot of power. And at the head of that was David Ben-Gurion and his Mapai party, felt that creating a constitution would not be possible because it would require facing head on the real internal divisions between themselves and the different parts of Israeli society at the time, including the religious sector. Now, the religious sector was far smaller and far less vocal than it is today. But interestingly, Ben-Gurion felt, and probably correctly, that a constitution adopted at that stage would seriously erase the sensibilities of the religious side of the Jewish community in favor of a very liberal, equality-driven constitution. So he actually pushed not to have it. Wild.
Which is quite interesting considering who the sides are there and how he generally feels about religion.
Yeah. And the discussion at the time is so amazing because you have the Chazon Ish, who was the leader of the more ultra-Orthodox at the time, and he very famously called Ben-Gurion and the whole secular Israeli society, called them an empty wagon or an empty boat. He felt they were devoid of any real content. And Ben-Gurion, on the other hand, had compromised. And the content of this compromise is now very heated because he turned to the Chazon Ish and said, listen, we won't draft your yeshiva students, a couple of hundred.
Yeah.
And that status quo has now remained till this day, where you don't have a couple of hundred people not serving in the army. You have now hundreds of thousands of people who've gone through this process.
Right.
So Ben-Gurion was very conciliatory, and it's really interesting to see what was driving his decisions. Now, he has a strong partnership with the Mizrahi party at the time, which with him creates the status quo of religion and state in Israel at the time. So that's why you have a religious marriage system, kashrut, Shabbat laws, all integrated into Israeli society. But part of that was, we just don't see how we can make a constitution. So they argue backward and forward about it, as Jews will. And eventually, in 1950, they have a compromise, the Harari law, which basically says, not the Harari law, the Harari compromise, which basically says, okay, we can't write a constitution now. So what we're going to do is we're going to write some basic laws that will evolve into a constitution. Okay, it'll get there. It'll take some time, but we'll get there. And everyone says, fantastic, we'll go evolution style. And we get 14 basic laws. Today there's extra 2 more temporary versions. But that was supposed to coalesce into a constitution.
Before we carry on, let me just ask you, the Declaration of Independence is often mistakenly maybe seen as the Constitution, because it does set out certain basic beliefs that we take to be truths self-evident, if you want to say, and that's actually what they want to do. So it's quite interesting that. So they did not just take that and say, well, let that be our Constitution.
Well, they couldn't, because a constitution really requires a lot more detail.
Right.
And what a constitution exists really to do is to limit government, limit government's overreach from one area into another, particularly into the private lives of the individuals.
Right. So that's important to note. In other words, it's not about a statement of beliefs, which is really what your Declaration of Independence was or is, but it's about placing limits on the power of the governing body.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not really, laws relating to individuals. And a lot of what, constitutions do will establish branches of government, the boundaries between those branches, and they never did it.
Right. And so the laws that were there, the basic laws, were there to sort of be some kind of compromise or movement towards these kind of
That's right.
constitutional laws.
That's right. But because it never gets there, all you land up with by 1992 is these basic laws. And two more get added in 1992. And at the time, then Chief Justice Aaron Barak looks at these laws and says, and he apparently uses a model from Canada, to say that these laws can actually now create a constitution, because the two laws that were passed in 1992, which were not passed with much fanfare and which no one paid much attention to, they created limits on what the legislature, the Knesset, could create laws about. Limited it, and there were just these two basic laws were passed, and no one really paid a huge amount of attention to them. But Barak definitely did. And he said because it included limitations on Knesset's legislative abilities, that essentially now created a boundary around the legislature. It created a limitation, like a constitution would do.
And just to clarify, who passes those laws is the Knesset itself, has passed those laws on itself.
Correct.
Okay.
So they've self-limited, according to him.
Right.
And then in 1995, there's this landmark case, Bank Mizrahi against Migdal, and massive legal, interesting discussion that probably no one pays much attention to, but we probably should have. And this actually now becomes a ruling where essentially the outcome of this case in 1995 is that the Supreme Court has now said that it has been given the right and the power to strike down laws passed by the Knesset, which are in violation of what is now a constitution, which has been reverse engineered from the basic laws. Okay, so Barak essentially turns around and says, what you've done, you haven't built a proper constitution, but the way that you've built what you've built in your basic laws now is going to function as a constitution. And he builds that in, and he runs that as a process till 1999, and increasingly allows the Supreme Court to rule on issues that previously they had not allowed themselves to rule on because they felt that it was overstepping the bounds between the branches of government.
But because of those laws, those two laws in 1992, the Supreme Court could now, or felt empowered to do so.
It felt empowered to do so. And observers around could have, or perhaps should have at the time, turned around and said, hold on 1 second, that's not what we meant. Yes. Or no, that's not a real constitution. We need to make a real one. We're not there yet.
Right.
But that doesn't happen. And that's where the roots of this take place.
Okay.
And that's where human rights and international law now become part of how Israel's Supreme Court starts to strike down laws passed by Israel's legislature, the Knesset.
Okay.
And that's where it starts. Fast forward now to 2023. In January 2023, Yariv Levin becomes the justice minister, and he announces that he's really very dissatisfied with 20, 30 years of what he perceives to be a left-leaning international law-leaning Supreme Court in Israel trying to impose its values on the whole country without due process and without a constitution. And he's going to fight this and create a judicial reform process, because he turns around and says, you are imposing your values, as you said, from the, let's say, the declaration. But where are those values from? We didn't agree to that. So your values are now essentially ruling our lives. And that ain't fair. And that's not democracy. That is, at the end of the day, a coup, right? You have essentially usurped the power that Harari envisioned being developed by the people, and you've decided to take it for yourselves. So he says, now we got to shake the system up. Now, what's interesting is that he's not the first to say this. People have been talking about it since Barak began this process in 1992, including people who are quote-unquote left-leaning, who were not happy that now we've got this implicit constitution instead of the real thing.
Right.
So what Levine is talking about is not new. What happens thereafter is that this becomes a massive political issue. And the way he does it, or the reaction, who knows? But it blows up. And of course, we have those protests and massive internal strife in the Jewish people right up to October 7th.
And emerging a little again now.
And afterwards. So I think that's our, let's say, realpolitik context to this, which in and of itself we could do an entire podcast on. But now we're going to get into, I think, your first questions out of our 4 questions. Our Manishtana, this Pesach, is, I'm going to start with the question that you ask, should Israel be a monarchy or a democracy? So if I can stay on my box, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes, definitely. The Torah in Devarim says that, very famously, Som tasim alecha melech, you shall surely put upon yourselves a king. And this is a monarch, and there is a discussion about this in the Gemara, in Sanhedrin, in a Braita, in a Tosefta, and in the Sifra. And Rabbi Yehuda is the opinion that turns around and says, this is a mitzvah, it's a positive commandment, you need to make a king. There is a dissenting opinion, Rabbi Naharai, I'm sure will help you as much as you can get him to. But Rabbi Yehuda says, at the end of the day, it's a mitzvah to appoint a king. And the Rambam rules that way, and most of the mainstream halachic authorities rule that way. That is a positive commandment to appoint a king, full stop. And eventually, this is part of the whole vision for the Jewish future. It's the kingdom of David and his successors, and Mashiach will be a king, and the Rambam rules that as well. So I think the reality is the idea of a strong central government and a person in which that government is vested is not only not a problem for Judaism, but many of our commentators, the majority of the commentators, and the halakha seems to fall down that this is ideal. This is what God wants. So yeah.
Right, so that's what it looks like. But if we continue the pasuk, and we see, or in fact, I think it's the next pasuk, that then goes somewhere slightly different. And I think we can see where that goes, and where, of course, Rabbi Nehorai takes it as well. And that is where it says, Va'amarta, and you will say, I shall put upon myself a king. I want a king.
Who's the I?
And who's the I? Is the people. Okay. Right? And this is an interesting one, because this is where people start to argue as to whether this is a straight out mitzvah, which I will give you. It sounds like it is, because som tasim is a double imperative.
You shall surely.
So you shall surely, as we translate that, make yourself a king. But there seems to be some kind of proviso underneath. Now, the proviso can go 2 ways. It can either be that the people must ask for one, and then when they ask for one, there is a mitzvah to make a king, which would be what we call a constitutional monarchy, you could say.
Okay, so that would be the Netziv.
And that's where the Netziv goes.
Right. Okay, so the Netziv says that. The Netziv says at the end of the day, you have to, the people themselves have to reach their conclusion that this is the best, but that works. At the end of the day,
and that works for you.
That's in market.
And that's going to be working.
The Netziv says that the Torah says the monarchy is ideal, but you can't force it on people until they reach that level of understanding and conclusion on their own. But when they do,
not necessarily a proviso that helps your argument, but rather that says
Then
this is a concession to human frailty.
I get it.
Right. So
To
that
the
would be the first way
understanding
to look at that next language. But the second
There's
way
only one
to see
monarch
the follow
going
over
to
Israel,
king
and that is
versus
God. But because people will be people, and the Jewish people are going to be weak and need a physical person around, then so as a concession to that frailty, fine, you can put a king over yourselves. And we actually see this, of course, in the Tanakh. So, for example, we have in Shoftim, in the book of Judges, we have the Jewish people asking Gidon to be the king, and Gidon says, quite frankly, no, God is your king. And he shuts that down straight away. Later in the book of Samuel, we have the same thing, which is where the Jewish people ask Samuel, for a king. And the issue, and let's just go back one step to that verse says that the Jewish people will say, I would like to put a king over myself like the other nations. And that's the angle, actually, where a lot of people start to say, that's not good. A king is not a good thing to have, but you want to be like the other nations. You want to have international law. You want to be like this. So therefore, this is not a good thing to have actually at all, especially in those days, because in those days, once a king becomes a king, he has unlimited power, which is what Samuel begins to explain to the Jewish people at length in the book of Samuel, where he says, the king is going to take everything from you. He's going to take your sons, your daughters. He's going to tax you. He's just going to be an absolute disaster. But you want one? Okay. And God tellingly says to Samuel at that point, you think they're rejecting you. You think they want a king for that. They're rejecting me. That very clearly seems to say that a king is no good. And I just want to take a look at how Abarbanel deals with it. And Abarbanel is quite interesting because he had experienced corrupt monarchies in his time in the form of Isabella, Ferdinand in Spain. And he sees the more democratic space of Venice as more of an ideal space. And he says as follows, he says, it is not impossible for a nation to have many leaders who gather together, unite, and agree upon a single policy, and for authority and judgment to be exercised in accordance with what they say. Why shouldn't their leadership extend for a year or for 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, or less than that? And when the turn of other justices or officers comes, they'll rise up in their place and faithfully investigate the offences of their predecessors, and whoever is found guilty should pay in accordance with their guilt. So in other words, he's saying very clearly, and elsewhere he actually talks much more forcefully, that a king, the problem with a king is that a king becomes for life, that a king becomes this idea of absolute power, and that's the issue. The issue is not necessarily maybe the form of government in the sense of whether a king or any other kind of leader, but rather the nature of kingship and where that goes.
Power.
Or the nature of power. Well, the nature of kingship at the time, which was unlimited power, as opposed to kings today, for example, who are more decorative. Well, not only at the time, but going forward throughout history. And the Sforno brings this. And that is the idea that kingship was passed to the
There's
oldest
also something else
son.
interesting,
Of course, about the nature
in the next
of
generation.
the idea of kingship, of monarchy
While the
specifically.
first
king may be fantastic, what about his son? And in fact, this is exactly what we see throughout our books. The Book of Kings will show you that while by and large the children of David and going down the line were generally good kings, but every now and then there's an absolute disaster, which tells you that this is about leadership. This is not leadership as in a person with leadership qualities, but rather just happens to be born first to the previous king. And that, as far as the Sforno is concerned, is the essential weakness then of the process. It's not necessarily an ideal way to have a leader. One, because maybe it's not God. Two, because of the nature of it in terms of its power. But you're saying now that no, it's a mitzvah. While there is a
sitting there
mitzvah
saying
of kingship, but if so, then my question to you is, why does Okay, if not Moshe, who hasn't walked into the land of Israel. But why doesn't Joshua become king? Why isn't monarchy something that then becomes an absolute priority, which the Jewish people do as soon as they land in the land of Israel?
So I think it's a good question, but I think you can answer it technically. As you said, it has to reach a certain point when the people reach that idea that they need a king. And I want to relate to what you quoted from the Barbanel and to just where they were at the time. Now, when did they request this king from Shmuel? They request the king from Shmuel when they functioned for a couple of 100 years as tribes who are more often than not able to work with each other. And that has both practical ramifications, but it also has existential ramifications. So practically, they keep getting attacked from these outside forces. And because they are not one unit, they don't have a common army. They can't defend themselves. And therefore, they need they just need to organize something. And I think that there's a real recognition that you need to find a system that works well for defense. Secondly, though, there's this question of, are we a Jewish people? Are we a separate group of tribes, each going our own way? And that is a real problem that exists on a religious level, spiritual level, and emotional level. And they realize that they need a figurehead. And I'm not so sure that when you said like other nations, I do have my concerns about that. We don't have to have a king like other nations. And I don't think we should slavishly adopt whatever political ideas they have. Right? I don't know if I need a Hobbes Leviathan in all of Hobbes's vision or in Jeffersonian vision. But maybe I need some sort of Leviathan. And
I'll just stop you there and say it's not necessarily what we need, but how the Torah expresses our need there, which is seems to be a little bit of a put down on that specific idea. So
I agree, and there's the warning about the abuse of your individual rights, which you had before, and that is what Hobbes says. You give up, far before, 17th century, 16th century political thought. The Torah itself was saying this. You're going to essentially have to weigh up losing some of your personal rights in favor of the centralized government. I get that. But I think that the core question that we have to face is that in the disunity that they sensed was their greatest weakness. Now, I look at Israel now, and if we're going to draw this back in, and I'm looking at it and I'm going, we're actually leading our way back into that space. Before October 7th, there were people actively advocating to split Israel into two states, just like had existed in the split Commonwealth between the North and the South.
It's actually come up again now.
It's fully, and there's another guy who suggests splitting Israel into cantons, which is like tribal confederacy
back to the days of the judges.
Exactly, going back there. Yeah. And what did they experience? They were eaten alive by the surrounding enemies. It's a gift. So, the Barbanel does, and I think he's the only person of our commentators that actually exercised governmental power. He was a minister of finance. He was a minister of finance. He started in Portugal. Then he went to Spain. Then he goes to Italy. And then he lands up in Venice as he flees the Christian fundamentalism pursuing Jews at that time, the Inquisition and expulsion, etc., of the Catholic Church. But he saw it up front, and he saw the excesses that you rightly raised with the monarch. I get it. But the Torah itself limits the power of the monarch. In fact, you see that. So Abarbanel says that, he says over here, why shouldn't their powers be limited and regulated by laws and customs? But the Torah has that already. A monarch is not a free agent in their sense, not free agent. Is not an absolute king with absolute power. And I think the very introduction of limits on the power, on the military power, on their wealth that the Torah introduces, and you see it in the Gemara. The Gemara talks about that the king had to come to the Sanhedrin before he could wage war, the high court. And the Torah doesn't envisage a monarch with unfettered power. And in fact, you see all of the prophets in Melachim coming along and railing at Achav and his Ahab and Jezebel, his wife, for their unrestricted power. And there, I think, exactly, he's saying to them, maybe Jezebel, you saw unlimited power like Egypt, like Syria, like all the kings at the time, but that's not what we have over here in Israel. Our kings have law. Torah is above. So I don't see monarchy, the way the Torah is painting it, as a dire end game nightmare that you are. That's not Jewish monarchy. Jewish monarchy is not like the other nations, and I think that's what the verse means.
So there are two ways. In other words, what we're saying is you're saying that what the Torah is saying, ideally have a monarch.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a Jewish type of monarch which has checks and balances, which is what the Torah brings in specifically at that point, to say not too many horses and wives and
who
to
even
have a
says,
Sefer Torah.
who even says that his child will be king? The Torah never says that.
And the Torah does not say that. So that would be the one way to look at that verse. And the other way, which is what I'm saying, is that the Torah is not seeing it as ideal at all,
Correct.
but giving a concession to say, well, all right, if you must have one, make sure that there are checks and balances. I think this is really interesting because that's the theory, though.
Right.
That's the theory. The Torah, as we know, is giving the theory. And then when we start to come into the land, and now we've got this push-pull situation, is what we learn is that while the Torah may, and either way, although this is more to my side really, is that I think we can see throughout the history in Tanakh that the Torah meant a concession. Why? Because it never works out. It never works out more than a generation. They don't follow the rules in terms of the kings, by and large, will be swayed to power. And as we know by Lord Acton, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the Torah is always pushing against, and we understand this, and this is something you and I have discussed many times, and we speak about it in our Tanakh, a bird's eye view, that the Torah is there to shift the paradigm, one of the paradigms being that idea that might is right. That's how the world was run. And how did it run like that? Because your king, who was usually, if not the son of God, certainly a demigod or given the power by the gods, had all power and everyone else had nothing. So that's the end result of a king. And that's why the Torah doesn't really want that ever, because there's only one king, and that's God, as far as the Torah is concerned. But you know what? You're probably going to ask for one, because either that's reality, but then it's not going to work out well.
So I don't see that. I think that if you're going to make concessions to human frailty, look at the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges. So there's the alternative. Okay, no king. What does the book end with? It ends with 2 horror show episodes. You land up with the concubine in Gibeah, where the moral structure and fabric of the whole of the society has frayed completely.
And is that because of no king?
Well, that's definitely part.
That seems to be part. I
of
will
what
give you
is
that.
driving them, that they want a common law and a common justice. Now, it's interesting. We talk about draconian laws, right? Where's that from? It's from King Draco. Okay, Draco was in Athens, the first person that
Not Draco Malfoy?
No,
Okay.
no, actually, before him slightly. 600 BCE. What did he do? He instituted the first written laws for Athens, as opposed to their oral law. Okay, we talk about draconian laws. Why? Because he instituted the death penalty for almost every single law. And
Interesting.
And when questioned in the life of Solon, Plutarch says that when they asked him, said, why did you institute the death penalty for the minor ones and the minor and major infractions? He said, I'll tell you why, because I think the minor ones deserve it, and the major ones, I didn't have anything worse left. So I didn't have any more penalty. But it reflects this need when you have a society falling apart, and how do you deal with it? And it comes in. So you turning around saying, well, if you put a king there, then human nature means the king will get corrupt. But on the other hand, the book of Shoftim says, well, if you don't put a king, human nature means they'll also become corrupt, and they'll end up raping and pillaging each other, like we see, God forbid, Sodom and Gomorrah inside the Jewish people, and then the whole Jewish people get together and they have a civil war.
And that's
which is worse?
And that certainly seems to be the outlook of Shoftim. I'm giving you this one, which says a couple of
But look
times,
at where we are now.
Vayamim hahem,
Yes.
Ein melech b'Yisrael.
And I'll give you that that's clearly written by someone who's got a pro-monarch agenda. But look at where we are in the state of Israel today. And this is where I think that these arguments have gone off the track. Because look at the state of Israel today. What's everyone arguing about? And that's your fourth question. Are we asking the right questions?
Right.
Now, everyone is spending all their time now arguing the niceties of constitutional law. And should we adopt a British system or the Canadian system? Lovely and important academic discussions. But what you see in Shoftim, and this I think, we are in Pesach, not in Shavuot, but this is where the book of Ruth comes in. Because that magnificent figure and book is the only book where the Torah says it's written exactly the same time, in the time of the Shoftim, where society is falling apart. People are worshipping idols, people are raping innocents in the street and killing them. And regardless of the political setup, the society is falling apart. And no one's discussing it. It comes along the book of Ruth, which seems an arbitrary, strange addition, and out of her comes the monarchy.
Right.
But that's only at the end. Why is that book there? Because to a certain extent, that book looks at the societal cruelties, harshness, and that is where the Tanakh puts its finger and says, you're not going to solve the issues with a purely political solution. But we need a way to look at what our societal bonds are or are not. And if you don't have those societal bonds, which is what I think Ruth manages to reestablish, and you see how she pulls communities and people together through her kindness, through her empathy, and it's a lovely, nice story.
But not through legislation.
Agreed. Not through legislation, I agree. But that at the end of the day doesn't mean that the legislation is the problem. It means that we're asking the wrong question. So legislation, and should it be this way or that way, I'll give you. I'm happy to even accept that kingship is a concession in the Torah. I'm happy to accept that. But I think that as far as it goes now, in the current discussions where things are, that's not the questions we should be asking. The questions we should really be asking is, and you quoted the pasuk, ve'amarta, and you shall say. It presupposes that the Jewish people are somehow constituting a single body in some way that has a common voice, some common voice. And
as opposed to saying va'amartem, for example, which is plural.
And that, I think, is the question that we should be asking. We can solve the logistical, clerical, academic, legalistic question. We can even maybe get a constitution together. But to do that, and you see that from South Africa, South Africa went through a brief window period where there was enough sense, either through resignation or through hope, that we could forge a better, brighter future together, despite all the differences. And we got a constitution together, but the constitution only came afterwards. The prior sense that we are in this together and we can do this, that's much more important. And that I don't see happening. That's what I think Ruth does. And I think she's a symbol of getting that message together. And I think that that's the question we should be asking this Pesach.
What's the question?
The question is, number one, are we asking the right questions?
Yes.
The answer to that, I think, is no.
No.
And then the second question, which is the follow-up, what is the right question? I think what is the right question is, how do we essentially find commonalities enough that we can use to paint at least one area of common voice, vision, hope, which does bind us together. Because at the moment, I think that these constitutional legalistic arguments are actually papering over the cracks that they will never fix.
So I wonder if that's the right question.
What do you think?
I mean, I think it is a right question, but I think where we're sitting, for example, if we just come back to today, is we have the people who are saying, how can you have the stripping of power of the Supreme Court? You are giving all the power then to the government. The other side is saying, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the other side is saying, how can you allow the Supreme Court to have all that power?
Agreed.
In other words, the question is, you're right, but I think that's the next stage. The next stage is bringing these two sides together. But what these two sides are doing is each one is blaming the other for having unfettered power.
And I think that that's my point, that they're arguing about power.
Exactly.
That's a power argument.
It's a power argument, which if we, Rabbi Sachs very famously talks about power as being a zero-sum game.
Yes.
In other words, either you have power or I have power, and we cannot both have power. And if you have power, I don't, and vice versa. And that's really what's going on. And that's the argument.
That's what they feel is going on.
That's what they feel is going on. And that's what's underneath.
My belief is that we need to shift the core engagement, not about power, but as Rabbi Sachs puts it, about influence, about how we engage not in the zero-sum game, but in the game where we all benefit from it. Now,
which brings us maybe back to Pesach.
Yes. And I think this institution of like bringing people around a table, this idea that the Torah comes up with, that you have everyone celebrate, you have these homes coming together and bringing that space into existence. The gatherings. That's where I think we're not doing the work that we need.
Correct.
Everyone is an enemy if they're not exactly on my spot. And I think the social media space has helped really, exacerbate this by creating these bubbles, and everyone else in a different bubble is an enemy. And that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. And I think that's what the book of Ruth essentially pushes, is bringing these bubbles into existence and expanding them and bringing others into them who are not exactly of my view. Ruth is a stranger. She's a Moabitess. She shouldn't be Jewish, etc., etc. She comes in and she brings everyone else who's been left out. Now, today we talk about, with these buzzwords, I don't like using them, inclusivity and other stuff, but the reality is that what a Pesach Seder does is it creates a common space where you bring people into the bayit, into the tent. And my worry is that without that, you can't solve the constitutional legal issues. And I think that the state of Israel today, definitely meets the definition of a democracy. I don't think you have to slavishly take on other people's definition of a democracy. The people elect, blah, blah, blah. How are the checks and balances? Are there enough checks and balances? Are they in this way or in that way? I think that could be debated. I think there are fears on both sides. But at the end of the day, what I don't see any of the leaders in Israel doing is like zooming out of that space and saying, where's the bayit?
Right.
Exactly. And I think when we talk about Dayeinu Bibi, is this enough? That to me is really what concerns me, because there's no one left at the table singing Dayeinu.
Right.
Everyone's left the table. There's no one at the Pesach Seder. Everyone's gone to make their own bayit and singing Dayeinu to themselves about the other.
About the other. And I would say that if you think about Dayeinu is about multiple steps to get to the land.
Yes.
It takes many steps. And again, something Rabbi Sachs says so often, building a society that cares for the other, that cares for the vulnerable, and that stops long enough to hear the other and to see the image of God in the other. That takes many years, and it is a journey of many multiple small steps. And
you have to say Dayeinu after each step.
And you have to stop and take that moment and say Dayeinu after that step. And so to me, what is going on here is that people are seeing, and I think that's part of what's going on in the world in general, and as you say, we won't go there in terms of where people are seeing a utopia that they want, and they want to go from here to the utopia and see no steps in between. And part of those steps in between is sitting down around the same table and drinking wine together. And breaking bread or scotch or matzah around a table together, and taking those steps and allowing the other, which, as you say, is what Ruth does. But I think it's also the other side of Egypt. It's the opposite of Egypt. If we say that Egypt is about ultimate power, Pharaoh, slaves, that's it. Slaves is also, you were always a slave. You were a slave. It wasn't what you did, as Rabbi Sachs says, but who you are. The breaking of Pharaoh's power, while it is a breaking of his power and splitting of the sea and his death, etc., but it's the ultimate breaking of his power is the Seder night, is the sitting down together and talking to each other and seeing the other. That's the breaking of Egypt, actually. And so I think that's what we're saying we feel Israel and ourselves and everyone should be doing on Pesach, sit around the table, have the conversations, ask the questions, ask other questions, but listen also to the answers. You don't have to accept the answers, you don't have to agree with them, but you have to hear them.
And with that, I think we conclude this Two Jews and a Scotch. For those of you who still have some Scotch, enjoy it. And we really hope that you benefit from this.
Two Jews and a Scotch is an initiative of the Academy of Jewish Thought and
Please
Learning.
God to all of us.
Search Two Jews and a Scotch to find us on YouTube or Spotify,
wonderful
or visit www.adult-ed.academy for more.
Amen.